Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Allison Wyckoff. I manage public programs here at the Asian Art Museum. Thank you again for coming. I'm just really overcome by seeing everyone in the room here. As you know, the museum recently opened Yoga, the Art of Transformation, the world's first major art exhibition about yoga, featuring breathtaking examples of yogic artworks from 25 museums and private collections in Europe, the United States, and India, which date from the 2nd to the 20th century. In conjunction with the exhibition, the museum is hosting a range of programs showcasing the broad and diverse practice of yoga, from art activities to performances to demonstrations, classes, and presentations, such as today's talk, Journey of the Self with Yoga Master B.K.S. Iyengar, a talk by our very special guest, Manouso Manos. So it's my great honor to welcome John Hayden, who will introduce Manouso Manos. John Hayden is leader of the Iyengar Yoga Association of Northern California and the Iyengar Yoga Institute of San Francisco. He's a certified yoga instructor and a member of the faculty of the Institute. He's held many roles for the Institute, including chairman of the board and contractor for the new Institute, which will be opening in its new home in the Pacific Heights neighborhood next week. Please join me in welcoming John Hayden.
I too am overcome. It is my sincere pleasure and it is a deep honor to be here to introduce Manouso Manos. I think the first thing that I want to say is that in my limited experience, a great teacher is a teacher who can reach into a student and draw out more than the student knew was there. And that describes my experience with Manouso as a teacher. Perhaps the greatest compliment I can pay to Manouso is to describe him in some of the same words that I would describe our teacher, our guru, Mr. B.K.S. Iyengar. And those words would be brilliant, and they would be insightful, and they would be dedicated, and they would be fierce, and they would be compassionate. So I consider myself lucky to be a student of Manouso's. I consider myself fortunate to live in this great city of San Francisco, where Manouso calls home and teaches. And again, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce him here today.
Thank you very much. I have to be on my best behavior today. My grandson is here. The subject is very dear to me because it's about me, but the fact is this is such a tremendous honor for me, a subject that I have dedicated so much of my life to, and so much of my life to trying to understand. The exhibit has that remarkable turn of word, this art of transformation. And the reason why I say it's this turn of word is it's not just the art that transforms a human, but also the transformation of what was known as yoga from the ancient times into our modern day. The descriptions that we give of what yoga is will always fall short. The description that has been given for centuries it's very much compared to the blind men who touch that elephant, and they describe it in a different way, in different facets. And as you would see by the art downstairs, that's quite apparent. The early years of the dedicated ascetics trying to find what the discipline of yoga meant and what it meant to them, and going through the period where they were set on a pedestal to the periods that they went in and they were held in high disregard, to the rebirth of yoga looked at from the point of view of the locals compared to the people looking in from the outside. We've watched this amazing contraction and expansion of yoga. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about my teacher, my guru, if you understand the word, B.K.S. Iyengar. And the problem with trying to describe yoga and the problem with trying to describe B.K.S. Iyengar is always the same. You can tell stories, you can give dates, you can put highlights of his life into view, but they don't give you the essence of the man. I will rely more on those stories because sometimes you can express into a human heart what you cannot necessarily give to their intellect. And my heart is dedicated to what this man has dedicated his life to, and that is this subject that's really quite important for the universe, in my humble opinion. So when we start to talk about yoga, when the early writings of this, which some people will date back from 3,500 years ago, and others will go back as many as 10,000 years ago, the description goes is that the vehicle that one rides into heaven is called a yoga. Now, it shouldn't be lost on very many of you, certainly not those of you who have any kind of a yoga practice, what they're expressing. What are they trying to say to us? And how it morphed into what we see it more like today. The vehicle that you ride in on eventually is the practice that puts you on your way towards enlightenment, samadhi, any of those words that we use, freedom, kaivalya. And then they talk about people trying to use every method, every perspective possible towards coming to that end. And it's shown so brilliantly in these works of art, these paintings, these sculptings of people trying to figure out what it meant to be alive, what it means to be in this universe, what is our purpose, where are we going? Because that's really all yoga has ever been. Now, the transformation that's listed in there can be woven, but you've got to watch and see the prejudice that's involved with so much of the art that we stare at. Prejudice in the good and prejudice in the bad, as peculiar as that may sound. Because you start to see these remarkable people who have dedicated their lives to trying to figure out who they are, some people were trying to wipe out, and others who were kings and great royal people were bowing at their feet, or making sure that there were pictures or portrayals of them next to these yogis, yoginis. And they talk downstairs in just these minimal kinds of terms of the great advent of women, yoginis, and then their contraction and expansion, and at some point they're frightful figures. Now, I use this as a background, even though many of you have already seen this exhibit or will see soon as we are finished here, and I've been here more than once to see this exhibit. I think it's brilliant. I think they've done a great honor to the subject. But you always want to watch the background piece and what's expressed and what you're really seeing and how do you relate to it, because this is what I really want to get to. You see, the story of Iyengar is told still in this background, in this backdrop of what yoga is and was. And he had to deal with all of the history that came before him, and he was dealt a role because of his place in modern technology, modern history, modern India, even though now we're dealing with a 95-year-old man. So what am I talking about? B.K.S. Iyengar was born in 1918, and that date will stand out for some of you history buffs for it being the outbreak of the great influenza of 1918. If you start to read the figures of this is the disease that swept across the earth, killed more people than anything that's ever happened before on the face of the earth. It went through India twice. wiping out 1 in 5 of its population. Imagine that. 20% of the population of India disappears in 1 year. B.K.S., he was born in December. Why does this matter? His mother was, in fact, afflicted with this influenza, and she was there, had it while she was pregnant with B.K.S. Iyengar. He was born a sickly child, grew out of this. Now again, this is the same story we tell about many of the world's great figures. They came from adversity, they rose up through the heights. He came from physical adversity. And those of you who've been downstairs to see that remarkable film that was shot in 1938 of a 19-year-old boy called B.K.S. Iyengar, you'll start to see the strides that he made in his health between point A and point B. Relatively poor family. His father was an educator. His mother was also from a Brahmin family, and they arranged the marriage of their sister, or excuse me, their daughter, B.K.S. Iyengar's sister, to a Brahmin fellow who was supposed to be of tremendous intellect. And that man is T. Krishnamacharya of Mysore. He's also depicted in that film, quite brilliantly, may I add, an astonishing figure by anybody's estimation. But if you start to hear the story of this fellow, Krishnamacharya, he was, in fact, a university student of great merit, and he achieved what is considered to be the equivalent of 6 doctorate degrees in 1 year of study. No one before him or after him has ever achieved this in India. He was considered to be an expert in all of the philosophies that they call of India. I mention this to you because in his university days he was quite outstanding. But I also want to put this in the perspective of history. You have to remember that the Indians were ruled by the British and before them the Mughals. And because of that, they were always recognized in their own community, but they were also had to have someone over top of them with some regularity. When it came to the yoga practitioners, to those people who seemed to have a bit of understanding as to how the universe worked, they were both revered and, of course, rejected. If you walk into a village, the first thing you want to identify if you're trying to take over that village is the power people. You have 2 choices. You either take them in or you get rid of them. And of course, both of these happened in India. And that's well represented downstairs. The yogis are to be shunned. They're to be pushed out. And they ran. They ran to the hills. They made their way into the Himalayas. They went into the jungles. But also there are these pictures downstairs. The kings, the Mughals, are sitting and conversing with these yogis. What they know, I want to know. The interaction between them and me, I want some of their shined light to shine on me. Krishnamacharya goes when there is a Reclaim India movement going on while he's a university student. And he takes on these darshans for his own reasons. I will not answer for this great man. But I would suspect that at least part of what he was interested in is trying to make sure that there was an understanding and a leftover of not allowing the Indian culture to die or to be transposed underneath another society. But we all know that societies have ways of interacting with each other. They bleed together. There is a sharing of information, and there always should be. That should never go away. But he became such an expert and such a learned man that at some point in his life, he ended up falling under the patronage of the Maharaja of Mysore, who was supposed to have been a tremendously wealthy man, a great learned man himself, and he wanted to have people of Indian culture around him to help preserve as much as would be possible under the British rule. And he dedicated himself to that with a great deal of fervor. He dedicated himself to pushing Indian music, Indian dance, Indian philosophies, and he would bring people in and have them watch while these matters were discussed and while they were in fact performed. Well, Krishnamacharya himself had become part of this grand movement of not only preserving these other Indian philosophies, but certainly yoga. It is represented downstairs very well, but it's also represented in the book about what was going on in India and in the 40 or 50 years coming into T. Krishnamacharya. And they talk about the mixing of Western and Eastern cultures, this coming together of the physical arts of Northern Germanic peoples as well as the British who were there, and that there's this mixing of this bodybuilding coming out of England, out of Switzerland, Sweden as well. And it is suggested that some of the body culture that came out in America through Kellogg and through Europe, through some of these other people, was an influence on India and an influence on yoga. Now, let's not get lost here. The asanas that are said downstairs in 2 or 3 places to be something of a modern invention have their distinct roots over several hundred years, and that is well depicted downstairs. There's pictures of people standing on their head, there's pictures of people in seated postures, and then beyond that, other things have been implied. We have yoga texts from 500 to 800 years ago that start to describe really quite in detail what goes on with these particular positions, asanas, seats, if you will, and what they're to be doing. But you have to remember that yoga has to follow the times, and the times have to follow yoga, and yoga has to follow science, or it would be rejected outright. So the physical culture that comes on to the rise at some point obviously interests this fellow T. Krishnamacharya of Mysore. And when they start to talk about the earlier trainings that were going on in and around India at this time, the beginnings of this physical culture, if you will, they start to talk about these people doing militaristic or martial art kind of training in yoga. The beginnings of Surya Namaskar that some of you know, these salutations to the sun, these positions that take you through this, this, and this, were described in detail before Krishnamacharya, or at least around that time. But I want to go through this a little bit backwards and then forwards again. Krishnamacharya actually made a comment more than once in his life that he didn't think yoga should be taught to Westerners. But you must appreciate that he may have come to this prejudice because of what was going on with the British at that time. Not because it was a hidden martial arts or that they were afraid of some sort of a military intervention, but in fact that they thought that this was one thing that could be preserved for that very individualized kind of practice for these individuals. Well, at some point, B.K.S. Iyengar goes to visit his sister and his brother-in-law, this fellow Krishnamacharya, who's living near the palace in Mysore. And in his sickly state, his brother-in-law turns and says, "You should take up the practice of yoga. See what it will do for you. You're not doing anything in particular. You move in with us, as with many of the families of that time, and you could be here." And Iyengar says he wasn't particularly used to it, and in fact, he was treated quite badly by his brother-in-law. And many of the people who said that they had studied with T. Krishnamacharya would say what an intense or fierce individual they were. This introduction that was given to me was fierce, and I only wear that badge like Tyra Banks tells those women that model for her that they have to be fierce. I'm quite a pussycat, actually. But if, in fact, Krishnamacharya, in his intense personality, did take up the practice and was being given it by this kind of militaristic martial art kind of training, bodybuilding kind of training, he seemed to have given some of that to Iyengar. Now, you have to also go back in history about the difference between a mass movement that is yoga today and the way that yoga was probably given over several thousand years, most of which we can mark. You have to understand that the yogis at the time of Buddha, and Buddha has very clearly said that he studied yoga and tried to find out what it was about. He was trying to find out what the truth was. He was trying to find out why he was an individual, why he had taken birth, if there was a meaning to life at all. And he dedicated himself towards that end. Well, the yogis at the time, the practitioners at the time, were in fact trying to figure it out, and they would collect a small posse of people. They would have their own disciples, and that they would give what they understood about this or what they were trying to figure out about this, and that would move on from there. The early trainings coming right up into the 17, 18, even the early 1900s were certainly only done in this way. And if Krishnamacharya talks about only having 2 or 3 other of his colleagues near him while he was being given instruction by his guru, this Brahmacharya Ramamon, or Ramamon Brahmacharya, I've heard both of those givens as to his teacher, his guru's name. And Iyengar himself was only a small group of young boys who were allowed to be taught yoga. Krishnamacharya was in the palace of Mysore only to teach the royal family, young Brahmin children, and to organize events that showed people what yoga was. And the Maharaja was willing and able to send Krishnamacharya with his young band of boys around to different fairs and places all across South India to show them what this art of yoga was. When Iyengar comes on the scene, he eventually starts to find his way, that he finds his body quite stiff, can't move around, can't figure out what he's supposed to do. He also knows he doesn't have anything to do with his life, and he's dependent on his brother-in-law to get him his way from day to day. It seems that Krishnamacharya was so remarkably fierce that at some point the star performer disappears, runs off in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. And so Iyengar's put in the lead spot. Now, if you see the film that's downstairs, you can actually count off the cadence of these poses, as would have been done for a performance. They compare many times in the book that is supplementary to this exhibit, remarkable book. I do suggest that you purchase it because it does talk about the history. But one of the things they talk about is this vinyasa and how one pose leads to another. They talk about Pratabi Joyce, who was also a student of Krishnamacharya, and they suggest that there are elements of this, both of these systems, that you can see in that film, and I suggest that that's true. I personally was lucky enough years ago to set a videotape, for those of you who remember what that medium was, on a TV and showed B.K.S. Iyengar one of the series that was being taught by Pratabi Joyce. And Iyengar starts giggling. And I said, "Why are you laughing?" I said, "It's actually quite beautiful." He said, no, not the poses. He said, "This is the way I was taught." And then he starts, ek, dwi, tri, chat, ek, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. He says, "What?" He says, "We used to do these performances and you had to be there." He says, "If you were the front, you couldn't tell what the guy in the back was, so you had to, or Krishnamacharya, it was time to change, and call out the name of the pose, wherever it may be." But you understand that the performance was really quite different. My wife, Rita, and myself were lucky enough to be here the day before the exhibit opened in San Francisco. It was really quite remarkable. It was quite beautiful to go through the place as they were showing the donors to this museum and some of the other officials the exhibit. And I got to overhear a woman who had never really seen anything but had watched a yoga demonstration for the first time in her life, and she was the docent on that tour. And she says it was very much like a dance performance. I appreciate that. It is an art form, and it's supposed to have a sense of attraction for people, and that's what Iyengar was charged with. Now, the personality makes the man, the times make the man makes the times, the man makes his own personality. Iyengar's all of those. If, in fact, he finds himself at the front and really likes it, he begins demonstrating yoga, and he does it with a vengeance, and he's done it for decades. He has not varied in that. He did a tremendous demonstration here in this city in 1984 at Davies Symphony Hall, simple walking distance from this place. And here's a man 60 years old in a pair of shorts on a beautiful silk rug, pushing himself through the same kinds of poses and maybe even at the same cadence as had been given to him when he was a 14, 15, 16-year-old boy. But let's go through that just a bit. There's a remarkable turn in history when you start to see that all of a sudden yoga, instead of being among a few group of mostly boys, the girls that are featured in the film that are mentioned are not shown in this exhibit, but there are females in there. And when you read, in many cases, they'll say unidentified. I'm a lucky man in a lot of ways, being the right guy in the right place at the right time. But I happened to be in India when this film was rediscovered and put up at the Institute in India, in Pune, where B.K.S. Iyengar lives. His daughter, Geeta Iyengar, his son, Prashanta Iyengar, are yoga teachers of great merit who both work out of that place. But they showed it to the public at the same time that Geeta Iyengar and that Prashanta Iyengar had got to see it for the first time in their entire life. This is in the mid-'80s. And I remember not being very far from Geeta, and as they start to show the film and the women come on, she goes, "Oh, there's Auntie, and there's my cousin." So it was a family thing. And when they describe it in the book, they say it's more like circus performers with somersaults and et cetera, because Krishnamacharya is taking his children, like I take my grandchildren, and I have taken my children, and I move them around. He just did it in a very sophisticated fashion. Going onward. After just a few years of yoga study in this manner of teaching, the way Iyengar describes it is Krishnamacharya would come up to him when he was doing household chores, and he'd say, there is a pose called Udhita Trikonasana, and Krishnamacharya would snap into this pose and usually say, "Show me yours." And Iyengar, the young teenage boy, would have to snap into that position. And he said sometimes he would be adjusted or kicked or smacked on the head or grunted at or heard, "No, no, completely wrong." And then 2 or 3 days later, he may come back to him and say, "Show me your Udhita Trikonasana again." And that old style was really one of the ways that the Indians had been treated by the Brits and as that kind of servitude. And it was inflicted on that martial art kind of militaristic training, the way yoga was being instructed. This is the system, school, whatever you want to call it, that he got from his guru. Now, I mention this to you because think of what now goes on. This is where the modern story really takes hold. When Iyengar's a young boy, someone writes a letter to Krishnamacharya that says, "I've seen your demonstration. Yoga really must be saved for the ages. This is an important piece of what India is. Send a yoga teacher or come yourself to a place called Pune, India. We want you to start giving instruction in the girls' school." So they look around. None of the other people who is doing yoga under Krishnamacharya has any interest in it. Most of them do not have any language skills. At least B.K.S. speaks English. He does not speak Marathi, which is the language of Pune in and around Maharashtra. And he's also one of the youngest, so Krishnamacharya turns and says, "You go. You have a 6-month contract, teach at the girls' school." Well, here we go. This is where the first part of the most important part of who B.K.S. Iyengar is, and the debt that the entire world owes to one particular individual. Because he makes the transition from teaching 1 or 2 people to teaching en masse. When I teach 8 to 10 people, I can, if they're making a mistake, I can adjust one after the other and put their bodies into position with very few words. If I'm a young boy teaching a group of young women, I do not have the option to put my hands on them in India in any way, which means that the entire language that one uses and is developed to transfer information from a teacher to the student has to be made up. It comes out of nowhere. So when the book starts to explain that if you talk to somebody 150 years ago about what yoga is, you talk to somebody now about what yoga is, those people in the past would not recognize the subject at all, because the transmission level is completely different. And it's standing in front of 30 people trying to describe to them very particular kinds of nuances of how the pose will come. That's number one. But let's go through this just a little bit more. Iyengar starts teaching, and the early practitioners under him, I was not one of them, strangely enough. Even though 40 years into the subject, I still cannot claim to be one of his earliest students. Those people go back way past me. But some of the very ill people of India, word gets out on them that this man is a healer. Now, the roots of this don't start with B.K.S. Iyengar. They talk about the grand glory of this physical culture, as it may be called, coming out of India, creating yoga bodies that are really quite resistant to disease, quite beautiful to look at. And you can even see the remarkable figures of these yoginis from the 800s, 1300s downstairs, so remarkably well represented. But when they start to talk about people doing asana, this very one part of what yoga is, of its many different pieces, they start to talk about that it will start to take care of different pieces of you, stimulate your organs, stimulate your chakras perhaps, and that the roots of this go back several centuries, but they are starting to become more apparent, and there are people trying to marry Western and Eastern science together. However, within the confines too of this, you still have to remember that yoga is still being ridiculed by a lot of people. This is also well represented downstairs. There are the showing the people lying down on beds of nails. The beginning of Iyengar's book, and I'll talk about Light on Yoga in a moment, he actually makes a comment, is when I tell people that I do yoga, they ask me if I swallow glass or sleep on a bed of nails. So he was well aware of the fact of the prejudice that was going on within the confines of yoga was. One group of people is espousing that yoga will cure everything. Another group is they should be shunned, ridiculed, and stayed away from because they're all thieves and fakers. This is the yoga world that Iyengar finds himself in. In terms of what you also see downstairs, you'll start to see that the asanas, postures, as we recognize them today, have their roots from long ago, but even among yoga and yoga practitioners over the centuries, those are also held in ridicule as well. The stories of the 8 limbs of yoga, yama, niyama, that's the moral and ethical code. Keep yourself clean, read the good books, those kinds of things. And then the progression goes asana, pranayama. Asana is the control of the body through position, work. Pranayama is the control of the energies of the body. And specifically, the breath is the way in. Pratyahara, the next stage, or limb as we like to call it, is the understanding of the senses and how not letting yourself be controlled by them. And then dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. Roughly, concentration, meditation, absorption, or freedom. But you'll see that there was a severe prejudice even among the people who were practicing other forms of yoga against asana. Vivekananda, who's mentioned downstairs, who's got the huge exhibit on the wall, had a prejudice against the subject himself, which, if you know his history, is somewhat understandable. His teacher actually was an asana practitioner, had been for a long period of time. But he decided that Vivekananda himself was not actually suited to the poses and pushed him in a different direction. So Vivekananda says, if you really want to do something, you have to move in this fashion. Understandable. Well, Iyengar faced this his entire life. He started to tell people that the act of transformation can, in fact, begin with the body. And his comment has always, in fact, been that if your body is unhealthy, if your body is in pain, you will not be able to transform it in the way that the mind should be able to be freed. And that the absorption of the body, the absorption in senses of balance, the absorption in allowing yourself to stay in the same position, to shoot away and push away absolutely everything else in the universe, can be learned by just sitting, but can also be learned by putting yourself into somewhat stressful positions and starting to absorb them into their fullness. This comes out of Krishnamacharya. It also comes directly out of B.K.S. Iyengar and is espoused by him over and over again across the world. When they talk about Iyengar's early days, he had gotten fired from the girls' school, and he would pick up a private tuition here and there to keep himself alive, gets married. But for some reason, a few of the members of the Parsi community, the Zoroastrians in India, take some interest in Iyengar and decide that he really is quite a genius. And one woman says, I'd like to create a class for you. And he says, as you choose. So she gathers all of her friends and tells them what time class is going to start, but she could not tell them what time class would end. I know this woman. She is absolutely a brilliant practitioner, now in her 90s. And she says the first class lasted 4.5 hours. Everyone was exhausted. And the next week, to get a class, she had to find an entirely new group of friends. And for those of us who know Iyengar, that's exactly the way we report it. Now, it always sounds like, from an old man like me, that the story of, when I went to school, it was 7 miles in the snow, uphill in both directions. But the people who came before me into this thing we call Iyengar Yoga always talk about, if you think he's ferocious now, you should have seen him before. You should have seen the guy I met 10 years before you got here. And of course, the guys that come 10 years behind me, I'm giving them the same story. Yeah, he was worse. He was better. You should have been there. But Iyengar decides that these postures are not just for show, but really are for transformation. Now, for those of us who are, and I don't want to just talk about this from the inside, or for insiders, but for those of us who start to see this remarkable journey of yoga, you can watch it and watch the journey that Iyengar himself took from point A to point B. You see, this exhibit cuts off in 1940, but yoga's explosion really has taken place since then. And it's mostly due to Iyengar. He won't get the credit he ever deserves, because the world now gets shrouded by those who write the history, and history is written by the marketplace, and et cetera. Now it's not that he's not big in the marketplace, but the truth is you'll see that his thing was not trying to reach the masses, but to try to reach the people who were seeking yoga through his guidance. It's a little different. He puts out his magnum opus, this thing called Light on Yoga. And it starts to show a few hundred poses, some of which he invented, many of which he named, many of which he took from old texts, many of which he got from other practicing yogis. He collected what he could, put out the work on the subject. Inside that book, he doesn't just give the poses, he gives sequences. He gives you a way to get from point A to point B in a set amount of time, 3.5 years. As a side joke, those of you who know this book, I've never met anybody that got through this book in 3.5 years. I mean, I've seen it all, I just can't do it all. And then he gets done with that, and then he writes Light on Pranayama. Starts to talk about the energies of the body. He goes on with his writing. He eventually writes Light on the Yoga Sutras. Sutras being texts written somewhere between 1800 and 2300 years ago that start to talk about the transformative qualities of what yoga will do and how it will bring you to a state of enlightenment. That's his personal journey. But because of who he is, because of how he is, because of the very nature of this very very specialized individual, you have to remember that yoga, in terms of the way that the asanas were, in terms of the way that the asanas were being developed, also went hand in hand with the technologies of the time. Even though there were photographs of yogis taken in the 1800s, there was a French crew that came through India a few times, and they showed these yogis in positions with full Padmasana, resting on a crutch, or with their legs behind their head, lying backwards in the pose that we call half Virasana. And these are documented 1875, 1881, etc. But those of you who've traveled extensively before the world became so small will also know that many of us have shot photos of people that they never got to see those photos. In the new age, I can pick up my phone and say, this is what you look like, and they smile. In the old days, it was like, well, I'll take your address, and then of course we pretend and we never send it over to them. There is a small chance that Iyengar is the first person that ever really got to see his own poses. Now, I'm not foolish about how broad that statement may sound. It's not the same as looking at yourself in a pool of water. It is not the same as looking at yourself in a small mirror, because you know mirrors were expensive at one point. Even silver was expensive, which is what was needed for the development process in the early photographs taken of Iyengar. And knowing that that is the truth, I think that when he started to look at what he looked like in these positions, asanas, I think in some ways he was horrified. And so for that, now, those of us who teach Iyengar Yoga, we all put on our little caveat on there, alignment, precision. I think that this all came out of this individual who thought he was doing one thing and saw something else, tried to clean it up. So maybe he developed the class. Maybe he developed even this ability to move from point A to point B with his sequences. In the back, the curative aspects of yoga are listed disease, affliction by affliction. This is what you do for lower backache. This is what you do for this kind of hernia. This is what you do for that kind of hernia. And then onward. The book still holds up today. But going onward with that, he was still a showman. So when somebody says, okay, there has been a horrible flood in Gujarat, Iyengar says, I'm taking my students, we're doing a yoga demonstration. We can raise money in Bombay, even though I'm not living in Bombay. We'll try to make, well, another person who hears about this horrible calamity of humanity is a fellow named Yehudi Menuhin. Yehudi Menuhin is there also performing in his violin. He's considered to be one of the most brilliant violin players of the 20th century. He shows up. There's somehow the interaction goes between B.K.S. Iyengar and Menuhin, and he eventually becomes Yehudi Menuhin's yoga instructor. That's the ticket to the West. Not in the way that most of us would think. It was a roundabout. He used to bring him, just to teach him yoga. Menuhin would bring Iyengar into Switzerland every year, into Gstaad, to teach yoga to him privately so he could up his skills and continue his skills on the violin. And then Iyengar used to tell the story of how he was being passed around among the rich people. They would send a limo over for him, and he would see another person this time in the afternoon, and then he would go back and stay in the basement at Menuhin's house, and this is the way it was moved. And after a few years of this, he turns to Menuhin and says, no more, I can't do this. He says, I'm not interested in only teaching the few select people. He says, I have to see if I can reach out, maybe do classes in the West, perhaps. Now, in this interim, too, comes Iyengar's first visit to America, 1956. He's brought into America by the Harknesses. The Harknesses are the patrons of the arts. If you go to New York City and you go by the Joffrey Ballet, on the side of the building, it says Harkness. Because these rather wealthy people were, in fact, patrons of the arts, and they brought Iyengar in to teach yoga to Mrs. Harkness and her children, and Iyengar only saw a few people and did one or two demonstrations in America at that point. But As fate would have it, eventually Menuhin turns him on and says, you should go to England and I'll see if I can find somebody there to set up a class for you. When Iyengar gets off of the airplane after being in Gstaad and he goes straight to London, there are exactly 3 people on the tarmac to meet him. And that's his first yoga class. None of them knew anything about yoga. None of them had anything to do with it. Iyengar started going back year after that. The first year he was there a week. Eventually he started staying a month, and he did that for more than 25 years in a row. By the end of that 25 years, you had to have been practicing for 7.5 years to get 1 class with him. Then also via Yehudi Menuhin, there is a woman in the United States, when Menuhin is playing in a place called Ann Arbor, Michigan, there's a woman that comes up and she's also interested in yoga and said, you know, I've been studying yoga for a while, and he goes, you have to meet my yoga teacher. And Menuhin says, there's this fellow named B.K.S. Iyengar. Well, this woman's name is Mary Palmer. Mary Palmer says she goes to India. She wants to study with the best. Of course, she wants it so much that when she wanted her home built, of course, she got the architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, to draw it up. She only wanted the best. And when she found Iyengar, she said, would you ever consider coming back to the United States? And he said, certainly, be happy to. So he teaches 40 people in Ann Arbor, Michigan, 1973, 1974. Eventually, when he's coming back again, somebody asked him if he would do a side trip and come into the Bay Area. 1976, he's teaching in the hills of Berkeley in Tilden Park. That's where I got to meet him. Now again, I also understand yoga, that I'm a part of history, and I'm also part of this great weave. I had been studying out of his book almost exclusively. I had nothing, I couldn't find a teacher, I had a good book. I was trying to figure out what he was saying in these rather short explanations of these asanas and poses. And my own journey is not of much importance. I can simply tell you that I had back problems that I could not get rid of, whether I was seeing Eastern physicians or Western physicians, and no adjustments or pills or anything else took it away. If I had found anything that would have relieved it, there would certainly be no way that I'd be practicing yoga today. But imagine I started getting better right away out of a book, when nothing else seemed to matter, or nothing else seemed to be able to inflict itself or help me in my life. And in my early years, I was interested in nothing but posture asana, just like most people are. But when you start to find the richness of the subject, and you start to see under this grand tutelage of somebody like this yoga master, that you can find your way where all of a sudden the entire world disappears, and that your ability to concentrate and to bring yourself inward is exactly what they've been seeking for 2,000 plus years. That the transformative quality of what yoga is can be manifest in standing on one leg, standing on one's head, sitting in position, moving around from position to position. But it is not done in a haphazard fashion. It is not done just for the sake of creating a better looking body, but is done, in fact, as a matter of meditation and awareness. Iyengar the showman was in front of the Pope, taught 1,300 people in China just a few years ago in his 90s, taught 800-900 people in Russia, finding ways to instruct people in this subject that goes back so far in new ways as time goes on. And strangely enough, he could have rested on his laurels. In other words, as he's coming into town, all he would have had to do is send that film of him at 19 years old and say, this guy's coming to town, and there'd be plenty of us that would show up. But for a guy like me, who for 40 years continues to go back, and even though I keep pretending with people that I know something about the subject, to have him present it to me repeatedly in a new fashion, reformulated, new way of digesting, new perspective on the subject, I find that the challenge of getting out of that body and into that moment is exactly why this is a yoga. And that there's no confusion about the old books talking about this transformation, this art, and this art of transformation becomes really quite clear to me. And that when you start to see this grand understanding of how yoga went very small and then just started growing and kept coming. Now, in closing, I'll talk just a little bit about really what started in '76 and not with me. And that is the remarkable transformation of yoga as it spread like wildfire. Yoga was already spreading in the United States at that point. But even when Iyengar went through in '73 and '74, it still was only reaching a smaller number of people. But something happened in America then, and something happened in Iyengar Yoga in 1976 that for no apparent reason, it just kept moving. And it moved very rapidly, and it moved with a tremendous kind of excitement. And nowhere did it move as rapidly as it did in this city. Yoga Journal started here. The Iyengar Yoga Institute started here. The wellspring of interest in this community it was ripe, and it was moving remarkably rapidly. To this day, this may be, and I'm still making a guess here, but I'm convinced that there are more people per capita studying yoga in San Francisco and in the Bay Area than any community on the face of the earth. There are many more people interested here. A lot of it came directly out of that 1976 visit. In 1984, when we rented Davies Symphony Hall for it was probably the world's first yoga convention, we brought Iyengar yoga teachers from around the world into this city and stayed here and studied for 10 days under Iyengar's tutelage. But just before the last day, Iyengar gave a 2-hour demo. And I was a big part of that. I was the chairman of that convention. And at the end, I told Iyengar, all right, we've paid all of our fees. We've paid everything that we're supposed to. We're keeping the film. We're selling this. By the way, I don't have it, but it can be purchased. It's not hard to come across. Of Iyengar demonstrating in his early 60s this remarkable subject. And when it's all done, it's he and I sitting down in a room, and I'd say, okay, sir, after we've paid off everything, including the production costs on getting the video out, we're offering you nothing except the profits from today's ticket sales for this event. I said, I'd like to cut you a check for $27,000, which in 1984 is actually a substantial piece of change. And Iyengar says, I can't take it. I said, sir, you did the work. I said, let me just give you this check, we'll pay off everything. He said, no, use it to propagate yoga. And I went, now wait a minute, hold on a second. I said, I think you should take this check just so that you can go home and tell people you made $13,500 an hour. He says, I can't touch it. It's not mine. And he literally went like this when I tried to put the check in his hand. This is a man who's dedicated himself for humanity. This is a man who's listed in the Oxford Dictionary of English synonymous with the word yoga. When they start to talk about the word transformation, this is it. Yoga transformed this very poor, not too well man into a world-class figure, and he transformed yoga to bring it out to the masses, till now the terms cannot be differentiated. That when you use the word Iyengar across the world, there are millions of people who have not met him will instantly recognize who you're talking about, though they've never even seen a photo of him. And then there's this man who has dedicated his life to nothing except, not to yoga, strangely enough, but to the betterment of humanity through trying to find reality. I got to see Iyengar for his 95th birthday, and I told him that I had been paid the great honor of being able to stand in front of the world's first art exhibit of yoga that was being collected for the Smithsonian and brought to San Francisco. And I said, "Sir, what should I tell them?" He said, "Those people who continue to say that those of us who are practicing yoga are only doing it for the physical are completely mistaken. And that there is no way to do anything else in this world without a body. And at the moment that you start to move the body, you start to move the self, and the seekers of the self are the seekers of their humanity, and that the seekers of humanity are the seekers of the self." I leave you with that.